各位长官、各位贵宾、各位老师与同学们，大家午安！非常欢迎大家在礼拜五的下午来到中研院来参加这场演讲。我是中研院数学所的陈之宁研究员，很荣幸担任今天的主持人。我想我们正处在一个非常令人兴奋，也可能有点焦虑的时代。人工智慧不只改变了科技与生活，也开始回过头来帮助我们理解一个更根本的问题：智慧究竟是什么？大脑与机器究竟是如何来学习、思考，甚至做想象的？人工与人类智慧的相像跟差异的地方到底在哪里？我想，这不只是一个科技的问题，也牵涉到社会、政治，甚至是哲学的问题。那也就是今天这个演讲的主题。然后它代表的，它背后的也是一个新兴、充满潜力、非常跨领域，我相信在未来会带给大家很深刻的影响的研究方向。那今天的演讲也跟本周礼拜1到4在台北举行的一场国际研讨会来呼应。那这个礼拜我举办的是一场由美国的 Simons 基金会所支持的以物理方法来理解学习的系列的研讨会。我们邀请了来自世界各地横跨物理、数学、人工智慧、神经科学的学者来到台北。那今天的讲者就是这个Simons Foundation 所资助的国际计划的和主持人。我非常开心今天能够有这场演讲。那也要特别感谢中研院，然后尤其是我们国际事务处所有的同仁所有的支持与帮忙。那在正式开始之前，我们非常荣幸能够请到陈玉如院士代表院方为今天的活动来做一个开场。那我们以热烈的掌声来欢迎陈院士。
Professor Ganguli, VP Zhou, and also distinguished guest student and Professor Chen. It's very nice and honored for me to stay here. I will actually start my service as a vice president following the path of VP Zhou, starting from August 1st. So today is like an internship. And when I received the email from President Chen's office to host the event from the Institute for Mathematics, I said, wow, mathematics. Nobody, at least for me, it's always difficult for me to understand mathematics. But then I see the information about the speaker, Professor Ganguli from Stanford, and I said, wow, what a nice opportunity for him to come to Taiwan. And for me, I'm actually a chemist working on data generation technology development for proteomics. So we are facing tons of the protein, tons of DNA, RNA, a lot of molecules from the nature. And the data generation is not an issue, it's not a bottleneck with the advancement of instrumentation. But then how to interpret data, how to resolve the complex human protein network is really the key. So with the AI gradually changing the life, changing the research, the way we are doing the research, or even our daily life, people has a lot of expectation from AI. But even though we have a lot of nice tools from the AI, there's a lot of fundamental questions. Whether AI can learn the intellectual intelligence from like human beings, how does the AI learn from the human brain, and what are the relationships? There's a lot of fundamental questions. And I can use my experience to ask questions from Professor Ganguli later. We recently started to have agentic AI to take care of the proteomic data analysis. I keep the same question to my collaborators, Professor Kunping Wu from Yangming Jiao Tong University. How do you know AI is going to be smarter compared to human brain? And how do you know, how do you train the ability of the AI to be smarter? When we face the many biomolecules from nature, or we can say human from God, how do we know the AI is able to dissect the secret from the data? And even a bigger question is, how do we know that AI could be something we never can expect? And to me, as a scientist, the most interesting question is to resolve the human biology, to resolve the health and the disease, and benefit for the patient. So AI is likely the key for the future. But it's like a black box. I keep the question, how do you know, how do you train the AI to be smarter? If A trained AI or I train AI, who will win? We never know. So I think there's a lot of information and a lot of fundamental questions that really require further exploration. And this likely involve interdisciplinary research work, collaboration in physics, neuroscience, computational, engineering, and even the clinical expert. And I think that is what Professor Ganguli brings to these lectures. And he is really the pioneer to integrate physics and the neuroscience and also the mathematics into the field. And yesterday, I also tried to Google his information on the Google. I saw the TED Talk from him. Wonderful talk, really, really wonderful talk. So I think this is also the spirit of the academic Seneca, trying to create the environment for encouraging interdisciplinary work from the different fields. So I'm hoping that we can take this opportunity to welcome him, and you can also get some inspiration. How can people from different fields talk to each other, work to each other, especially from translating fundamental research to the benefit of the society. It doesn't need to be medicine, it could be anything else, energy or other research field. And so this is the environment that we hope to continue to establish following the path of the former president and VP Zhou, especially in the division of physical science. So today, I hope that everyone can get some inspiration and enjoy a relaxing Friday afternoon together with Professor Ganguli's talk. So please join me to welcome Professor Oh, sorry, I forgot to say something. Sorry, this is my very first event as a new position, so I'm still learning on the way. I want to take this opportunity to thank Professor Chen. Without her invitation, it's not going to be here. I also want to thank the Office of International Affairs, where the colleagues, they even prepared the opening remark for me. And they prepared a lot of information for me in Chinese and also in English. And I also saw that there's a lot of detailed preparation, who will give the water, who will give the flower, a lot of detail. So I want to thank our colleague to make this a great event feasible. So I hope everyone enjoy a beautiful afternoon. So please join me to welcome Professor Ganguli.
OK， 今天我们非常有荣幸的来请到Ganguli教授。Ganguli教授任职于美国史丹佛大学的应用物理系，然后同时也是史丹佛以人为本的人工智慧研究院的资深研究员。然后呢，他也是在史丹佛大学在电机工程学系跟神经生物学系都有合聘的职位。然后他领导了一个是神经动力学与计算的实验室，非常的 productive 的 influential 的实验室。那他的学术Ganguli教授他的学术训练呢，横跨不同学科。 就跟我一样，我们其实都是学弦论出身的。然后他的训练不只是在物理学、在神经科学，还有甚至在人工智慧3个领域，都有他的轨迹。然后他的研究的工作的核心的问题就是说，无论是生物的大脑或者是人工的大脑，他们究竟是如何来从资料中做学习？那我们所谓的智慧以及计算的能力又是怎么样来产生的？那他的研究运用了物理与数学的工具，来为这样子非常复杂的一个现象来做一些理论的研究，那是非常少能够像Ganguli教授这样子，在各个领域都有非常非常影响甚多的影响。那他的研究结果也深受肯定，这就是 long list of prizes, right? So 包括了史丹佛大学的 Terman Prize and Sloan Research Prize and McKnight 那个是神经科学的奖项，然后 Simons 基金会的 Investigator Award， 然后还有美国国家科学会的最佳职涯奖。然后他的论文更2度来获得顶尖的人工智慧会 NeurIPS 的最佳论文奖。然后当然最近呢，近年呢，他也得到了Schmidt Science Award。所以呢，这些荣誉都肯定了他跨领域的各种学术贡献。那除了学术上的研究呢，Ganguli教授也是科学界中一位非常杰出的沟通者。我们刚刚有听到那个陈院士讲到他的 TED Talk， 然后他也有在国际的 AI 高峰会议上有跟一些非常有影响力的政界以及产业界的领袖来同台分享。然后呢，除了做 science communication 之外，他也任职在知名的创投公司，来搭起学术界与产业界的桥梁。所以我想这已经很长了，所以我想我们都非常期待Ganguli教授的演讲。所以现在就让我们以热烈的掌声来欢迎Ganguli教授的演讲，谢谢。
Okay, great. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I have no idea how much fun you made of me. But the good things are true, the bad things are not true, or probably actually the other way around, actually. Anyways, it's wonderful to be here. It's my 5th day in Taiwan. I've had an amazing time here. Wonderful food, very warm people, and Miranda's been an amazing host. So let's get into it. So I was going to talk about the science of intelligence. I mean, there have been remarkable advances in intelligence, in artificial intelligence, but we're also pretty amazing as humans, and even cats and even flies, actually. So the story of intelligence sort of starts about 500 million years ago, around the time of the last common ancestor of all vertebrates, right? All animals with a spine. It looks something like this, it took 500 million years to go from that to the human brain, right? But then remarkably, in a space of about 500 years, to just before Newton to after Einstein, humanity managed to figure out the laws of the universe, right? They figured out the curvature of space and time underlies gravity. They figured out the structure of atoms and nuclei. And then they used them to build technologies, which is incredible that we could do this in 500 years, right? But then remarkably, just in the last decade, there have been incredible advances in artificial intelligence. These things have become much more powerful, and quite alarmingly so, that we don't actually understand how they work, right? So they stand to transform our society, yet we don't understand them, right? So what I would like to have a unified science of intelligence that can explain how both brains and machines work in different ways, but through common principles. And we're going to need everything at our disposal to really attack this grand challenge, from physics to mathematics to neuroscience to psychology to computer science and more, right? And it's an incredibly exciting area, I think, to work in, and an incredibly important area to work in that's of vital importance to society. Okay, so I'll organize my talk by sort of 5 critical areas in which artificial intelligence can still improve, actually, in terms of order of magnitude performance gaps between AI and humans. One is data efficiency, energy efficiency, and then how we can go beyond evolution to create new types of AI using new types of potentially quantum hardware. And then we'll go into also explainability. How do we understand how these complex brains and machines work? And then we'll end with melding minds and machines, bringing them together to create new sort of understanding and experiences. Okay. So let's start with data efficiency. So this box, the area of this box represents how many tokens or words artificial intelligence is trained on. It's about 10 trillion words. Okay? Now that sounds like a lot, but is it really a lot? Well, you could ask, how many words does a normal adult experience over time? And the answer is about 100 million. That's roughly represented by the area of this little red spot at the center that you might barely be able to see, right? So we have a lot less language experience, right? It's true that we have a lot of experience in terms of vision and so forth, but if you think about what it takes to understand the laws of mathematics and physics, it's not clear that looking at more images of trees and streams and rivers will help us with that, right? So we have an infinitesimal amount of language experience, yet in 500 years as a species we're able to go from Newton to Einstein and harness the power of the atom and understand the universe from quarks to cosmology. So it's remarkable. So how is this happening, right? Well, let's think about how artificial intelligence scales. So, at OpenAI, they discovered these scaling laws, where if on this axis you increase the amount of data, and this axis is the error, for example, in predicting the next word when you're training a language model. So first of all, how are these language models trained? You just throw the internet at it, and you throw a big chunk of the internet at it, and then you ask it to predict the next word, increase the probability of the next word under the model. So this shows you how much of the internet you're showing at it, and the error in predicting the next word falls off as a power law. But the exponent of this power law is quite small, and these power laws or these scaling laws have captured the imagination of industry and have motivated significant societal investments in data collection, in model size scaling, and in compute investment, right? Right now in the US and all over the world, they're spending tons and tons of money on data centers to scale bigger and bigger models on larger and larger amounts of data. Yet surprisingly, there exists no theory that explains where these scaling laws come from. Why do we have these scaling laws in the first place? So recently, we came up with, in a collaboration with Mathieu Weyart, as part of our Simons collaboration that we have on the physics of AI, we came up with the first theory that can explain how these scaling laws appear on language models trained on English text, right? Or natural language text. And so what you're seeing is here's actual data measured from language models trained on natural text. And this dashed curve is our theoretical prediction. We're just predicting the slope. So the dashed curve is offset from these curves. But the slope of the theory curve and the slope of the experimental curves are the same. Okay? So now you can ask, what did we learn? What we learned is it's the statistical structure of the data itself that determines the power law. It doesn't depend on the architecture of the network. It doesn't depend on various other things that it might have depended on. It's just how complex is the data as measured by entropy and correlations. I won't go into the details of that. I'll stay very high level in this talk. I won't go into the details. But if you're more technically oriented and you want to see the details, this is always the reference at the bottom of the slide that always has the reference to the paper. So what we showed remarkably is that the structure of language itself determines the scaling laws. Right? But we might ask, are we content to stick with these scaling laws? Can we do better? Okay? And it turns out you can. it turns out that you can bend these scaling laws down to go from a power law to an exponential, which is a much faster scaling. Okay? How might you do that? Well, we figured out a way to do this, actually, for small systems. And the intuition is actually very simple. Let's say you train on 1 billion data points. Okay? Now you add one more data point. And these are just randomly chosen data points, right? So it's unlikely that the next data point will tell you much more than what you already learned from the last 1 billion data points, right? This is the redundancy of a large random data set. What if you could take the big data set and choose from it examples that are very different from each other so that they're non-redundant? And then you plot performance as a function of non-redundant data set size. Then you can get the exponential. And that's what we showed how to do. In fact, we predicted theoretically using physics ideas how to select non-redundant data and in a simple toy system called the perceptron. It's not, and these are the equations that we use to get that. So actually we had a theoretical physics prediction for how to bend the power law down to an exponential. And for the rest of this talk, we're going to go through in detail the meaning of these equations. Okay, so this cosine theta, I'm just kidding. You got worried there, right? But again, if you're interested in the details, they're in this paper. Of course, we didn't just stop at the equations. The equations suggested a way to do it algorithmically on larger vision problems, right? And then we were able to bend the power laws down in actual benchmark data sets. Okay. It's an open question, though, how to apply this at internet scale. Okay, there's another kind of interesting avenue, which is that we are not tabula rasa, right? We are the benefactors of 500 million years of vertebrate brain evolution. And the human brain has had a chance to organize itself over years of evolution to maybe turn it into an efficient learning machine, right? It has some modular structure and so forth. So we asked, what if we do combined simulations of evolution and learning, right? Can we evolve systems to become faster learners, okay? And so what we did is we did these simulations where we evolved these little critters, these little creatures here, to change their morphology or change their shape. So in each generation of evolution, we could add arms, we could add legs, we could add a trunk. There are all sorts of mutation operations that just acted at the level of changing the shape of the organism. So that's the mutation from generation to generation. Okay? But how do we select the best performing algorithms? Well, these organisms, again, all in simulations, they have a neural network, a simulated neural network, and we train it within a lifetime to solve all sorts of challenging reinforcement learning tasks. For example, just walking, or going up and down complex terrains, or picking up some object and moving it while going up and down in a complex terrain, potentially with obstacles and so forth. So we subjected it to a creature Olympics, right? It has to learn how to solve all these tasks, and it just has a reinforcement learning signal. If it does well, we increase the weights that helped it do well. If it does poorly, we decrease the weights that led to poor performance. Okay? So we get learning curves within a lifetime of how long it takes to train and how much better do you do. And then we tested them, and we had a population, right? Then we selected the ones that performed the best, that achieved the highest performance at the end of training. Okay? Then we muted them further. We made them have different shapes again. And we did this over 10 generations. And what you're seeing here is you're seeing evolutionary trees of organisms and their descendants and things like that. You see some trees that die out and don't become big. You see other trees that become big and dominate the population, just like you expect from evolution. And this is a time course of the different populations the ones that grew and became large. So the width of this bar represents the fraction of the population that's the pink population. This is the fraction of the population that's the brown population at the end of evolution. And you can see we only did about 10 generations of evolution. Okay? Now what we found, even though we were selecting for organisms that do the best, what we found is that the organisms that do the best actually learn much faster. Right? So it's like Lamarckian evolution where, originally when people thought about evolution, they thought things were Lamarckian in the sense that your father and mother learn stuff and they pass it to you through the embryo. And then when you're born, you know that stuff already, right? That's what they thought in the beginning. They didn't realize, later on they realized it's Darwinian evolution where you only pass the genetic code, right? And it's hard to imagine how skills that your parents picked up within your lifetime got transmitted through the genetic code. But that's what this looks like. It looks like if your parents took 10 hours to learn something, after 10 generations, your children might take 2 hours to learn it. Right? In this simulation, that's what we saw. Right? So it's as if skills are transmitted over generations, but that's not what happens. What happens is there's an implicit selection for faster learning. And the way it happens, we used physics to analyze all these different creatures. And the reason it got faster learning is the body changed to help the brain learn faster. And how did it do that? The body maintained passive stability better. So if you take the robot and just have it stand, will it fall? If it doesn't fall, if it can passively stand without any control signals, then that's called passive stability. Passive stability increased over evolution. The second thing is the torques, the forces that were required to turn the arms, they became smaller over evolution. So that means that the control problem was simplified. It could solve the problem by exerting smaller forces on the body. Right? So those two things reduced the amount of training it required to solve the problem. So basically, the coevolution of the body and the brain allowed the body to change to make the brain, to allow the brain to make it easier to control the body. Right? So there's all this, over 500 million years, a lot of these optimizations between biophysics, biomechanics and the brain must have occurred over time. All right. So in general, how do we train our language models or pre-train our language models right now? It's very primitive, right? Let's imagine that we trained our children the same way we train our language models, okay? So what would we do? We'd give them a big chunk of the internet and say, by the way, this is the next word. Then we'd give them another chunk of the internet and say, by the way, this is the next word, okay? How long would it take a child to read 10 trillion words? If you do the math, it's about 240,000 years, okay? Maybe if we did that for 240,000 years, our children might become really smart, but probably not. What do? We do a lot more than that, right? We choose careful curricula. We sequence a set of problems we give to our children. We have a model of how they're thinking. We figure out exactly what concepts they have that are incorrect, and we communicate the correct concepts to them, right? And we build up slowly over time, but in about 20 years, you get pretty smart kids, coming like all of you, right? So what we need to do, I think, we're very early in the principles of learning. We need to turn machine learning into a new science of machine teaching. And we need to figure out a better way to get human knowledge into the weights of neural networks, artificial neural networks. Okay, let's talk about energy efficiency now. So the brain spends about 20 watts of energy, power, right? Energy per unit time. Okay, how do we get a sense of is that big or small? Well, our old incandescent light bulbs used to spend about 100 watts, okay? So we're all literally dimmer than light bulbs, okay? We're not that smart, all right? What about AI? If you train a large neural network nowadays, the training can consume about 10 million watts, okay? orders of magnitude more than what the brain consumes. And there's talk of going nuclear to build nuclear-powered data centers that could consume 1 billion watts. Okay, where did we go wrong? Right? Evolution did not need to build nuclear power plants to power us. It figured out a way to do it on 20 watts. This is, I think, one of the biggest failures of technology today. So again, where did we go wrong? Unfortunately, this is a harder problem. I think I'm pretty sure where we went wrong is that we decided to do computation using very, very fast and reliable bit flips. For each bit to flip, a lot of electrons need to rush around transistors. Also, there's a lot of communication costs. The laws of thermodynamics demand that every fast and reliable bit flip must consume energy to make the process irreversible and error-free. Okay? Biology took a very different route. Okay? Biology is very slow, right? The clock speed of neurons is milliseconds, much longer than computers. And it's unreliable. Synapses can fail. Everything looks very stochastic and noisy and chaotic, right? You might think that's a bug, but it's actually a feature, because the final end-to-end computation is just good enough for survival, but the intermediate steps are not any more reliable than they need to be. Therefore, the unreliability you see at the intermediate steps are a feature of efficient energy design, right? In a sense, biology does not rev its engine any more than it needs to get its job done, right? So to really break this energy barrier, unfortunately, I think we're going to have to rethink our entire technology stack from electrons to algorithms and think about more stochastic, slow, unreliable computation along the way. Okay, so we've been thinking about this, sort of going back to first principles and asking, for example, what are fundamental thermodynamic limits on speed, energy, and accuracy for, say, chemical computation, right? Where you're computing using the shapes of molecules. And we were able to, using a field called stochastic thermodynamics, we were able to come up with fundamental limits, fundamental lower bounds on the error as a function of the energy spent per unit time in a simple chemical computer that senses external chemical signals. And moreover, we were able to trace the structure of chemical computers that hugged this sort of Pareto optimal frontier between energy and error, right? And when we looked at the structure of these chemical computers, they looked a lot like G-protein coupled receptors that hide inside every single neuron in your brain. And they're responsible for sensing external signals like pheromones and other signals, right? So it looks like biology has figured out how to optimize its chemical computation to reach this frontier in some sense, all right? But also the brain sort of acts as a smart energy grid actually as well. So I have a colleague, Tom Clendenin at Stanford, who can measure from the entire brain of the fly, right? But and interestingly, he can measure not only the activity of cells as they're firing to make the fly do what it does, he can also measure the ATP consumption across the entire fly brain at the same time. So ATP is the fundamental chemical fuel that powers all computation. It powers every process of life, right? So you break ATP to power any process. So you could ask a very simple question. When neural activity goes up in a certain brain area, does ATP go up or down? Right? You might think that it actually goes down because you're consuming the fuel to power neural activity. But it's actually the opposite. If neural activity starts firing in a certain brain area, ATP concentration actually goes up, and it stays elevated for about 90 seconds. Okay? Why 90 seconds? Well, if you look at the autocorrelation time of neural activity in the fly's brain, if a brain region starts to fire, it tends to fire also for about 90 seconds. So what this is suggesting is that the brain uses a predictive energy allocation mechanism. It predicts where and when energy will be needed, and it overproduces the predicted energy need before it's actually needed. And so it's it's like a smart energy grid, right? If you think about energy grids now, energy grids were very simple back in the day when we didn't have solar and all this stuff. We had central sources of power, and we had distributed sources of power consumption. And you just had to get the power from the sources to the sinks, from the power station to the households. But now we have individual households that have solar. Everybody can produce energy. And we need to match supply and demand and not waste supply and so forth. But the brain has the exact same problem. Every neuron can produce energy. Blood can flow. It's a completely distributed network. Not only is information and computation distributed, but energy production and supply are distributed. So 500 million years of vertebrate brain evolution must have developed amazing algorithms to match energy supply and demand to computational demands in a distributed way over space and time, right? And so we actually recently just got a big Simons collaboration to study energy consumption in the brain, from mitochondria and molecules up to blood flow. And we're super excited about this, actually. And so hopefully we'll have more to tell you over the coming years. Okay, another fun thing. This is the I know Jensen Huang is a hero, rightly so, in Taiwan. So chip design, I thought I'd throw in something about chip design here. So it turns out the dominant energy cost in chips is communication, right? Especially in GPUs, you have to shuttle electrons back and forth between GPUs within the GPU and so forth, right? So if you have sort of n computing elements, whether they're nodes in a GPU or neurons in the brain, you'll need order n squared wires to connect them, right? So then energy consumption will grow as the square of the number of computing elements, n, okay? So then the only way you can reduce energy is by making the wires shorter, right? Because the longer wires, you need to travel more, you have the sort of resistance, and you'll develop I squared R joule loss heating and so forth, right? So if you make the wire shorter, you can reduce energy consumption. But you can't do this in 2D. If your wires are in 2 dimensions, it's hard to pack the elements together. So a natural thing to do is to go to 3 dimensions. Okay, and our brain is 3-dimensional. But what can go wrong in 3 dimensions? As you grow a computing system, the problem is the surface area grows more slowly than the volume as you scale the system up. The heat generated in the volume needs to be dissipated through the surface area. So basically, if you make the system bigger, it's going to heat up and fry at some point. So there's a maximal size set by that. Basically because power consumption grows with volume, but the rate of heat dissipation grows with surface area. So, but the brain has evolved to become bigger and bigger. So how did it circumvent this fundamental physical problem? Well, the way that it did it is it used sparser spatiotemporal patterns. So for example, in the fly brain, neurons fire a lot more per unit time than in the human brain. In the human brain, they fire a lot less. Each of your neurons, on average, fires once every 3 times every second, 3 hertz, right? So in fact, you can look at the evolution of brains. So there's a beautiful book called The Human Advantage. Here's a scaling law, now a biological scaling law, where this axis is the number of neurons in the brain. And here you have mice, squirrels, monkeys, and humans. And this is the amount of energy consumption now measured in glucose consumption. And you can see that there's a scaling law, but it doesn't grow as the square of the neurons. It grows linearly with the number of neurons. So even though you're scaling up the whole brain, energy consumption is growing in the linear size of the brain, right? Not the square of the number of neurons. In fact, if you scaled energy the way that chip designers scaled their chips, then a fly brain would consume as much energy as a human, right? Which is crazy. I mean, it would not be possible. The fly literally can't get enough food into its tiny body to support that, right? So it's very interesting that the principles of evolution has discovered a novel scaling of energy with computation. So in any ways, we have a lot to learn from evolution in the way that we design our computing systems, but also we don't need to be limited by evolution. We can actually go beyond evolution to create new types of computing systems that use, for example, neural algorithms, but they're implemented in quantum hardware that evolution did not discover. Okay? So, for example, we could replace neurons with individual atoms, right? So neurons fire. When I say a neuron fires, it means there's a little voltage here that goes up and down. That's called a spike. The excited states of atoms, so atoms have electronic states that could be excited or unexcited. The excited state of an atom is the analog of a neuron firing. Okay? What we do, the connections, so synapses connect one neuron to another. As if one neuron fires, the voltage comes in, it releases some chemicals, the chemicals go to the other synapse and make the other neuron fire if it's strong enough, right? Those can be replaced by photons. So for example, an atom can go to an excited state, then drop, emit a photon. The photon travels to another atom, and it flips its electronic state to an excited state, right? So the communication between atoms can be implemented by photons. So what can you do with this? So my collaborators in the applied physics department can build, for example, quantum associative memories. These are memory systems that are built out of atoms and photons. You place a bunch of atoms in a Bose-Einstein condensate, and you shine light patterns between these two mirrors. So photons are flying back and forth. These photons couple the electronic states of the atoms, and you can store many stable memory states in this system. So it's a memory system, and it's actually an analog of something called the Hopfield associative memory, which John Hopfield recently won a Nobel Prize in Physics for, along with Jeff Hinton, and that was kind of an unbroken arc from the physics of Hopfield to the deep learning of Hinton. And yeah, this is a quantum version of that. I won't go too much into the details, but you can see that here. You can even look at the electronic states of atoms can become entangled with each other, right? And so you can use quantum entanglement to solve optimization problems in ways that you could not if they were not entangled. Basically, the entangled atoms, the spins of the entangled atoms can go into the interior of the so-called Bloch sphere and evade local minima that would exist if they were only on the surface in a semi-classical setting. Again, I don't expect you to understand that in detail, but the basic idea is the quantum dynamics allows better optimization that wouldn't be possible without the quantum nature of the system. We can also, my colleagues can also build systems of interacting photons called the covariant Ising machine to optimize very, very rough, complex energy landscapes. And we can understand the structure of these landscapes using ideas from statistical physics. Okay? All right, so this opens up kind of an entirely new field, which I like to call quantum neuromorphic computing. Okay, now let's go back to neuroscience. Let's go back to explainability, right? We don't understand AI systems, we don't understand the brain. We need to explain how they work. So how might we do it? It's going to be a long road, but a huge advance that's been made in the last 5 years is the mixing of neuroscience and AI, right? So what can we do now? We can you can record lots and lots of neurons from the brain while an animal is doing some complicated task. And we can build an accurate model of neural activity in the brain that predicts both neural activity and behavior. Right? So we call this roughly a digital twin of the brain. It's a digital version of a part of the brain that predicts the dynamics of that brain's activity while an animal is doing things. Okay? So that's a huge advance. But then this begs the question, Are we replacing something we don't understand, the brain, with something else we don't understand, just our digital twin, a complex model of it, right? Ideally, what is the reason for modeling? The reason for modeling is to extract conceptual insight into the system that you're modeling. How does it work intuitively? Also to extract testable predictions. How do I use this conceptual insight to drive the next generation of experiments? Right? To put it another way, if somebody handed you a black box that completely mimicked you, would you be satisfied that you have an understanding of yourself? Probably not, right? Okay, so we worked this out, for example, in the retina, right? So the retina is part of your brain developmentally. It's like a little stalk of your brain comes out and ends in your eyes. And in the retina, you have photoreceptors. These are very sensitive objects that are so sensitive they can absorb single photons through a quantum mechanical event. Channel rhodopsin changes its shape. It goes to so-called bipolar cells and then ganglion cells. So it's roughly a 3-layer network with some lateral connections. And each of you have 1 million ganglion cells that send optic nerve fibers, 1 million optic nerve fibers to your brain. And everything you know about the visual world comes from those 1 million optic nerve fibers. Okay? So what we were able to do is we were able to create the world's most accurate model of the retina. And what we did is we showed natural movies to a real retina. We collected the neural activity patterns. Then we fed those natural movies into an artificial neural network. And we trained it to mimic the firing of the actual biological retina. So we trained it over time. And remarkably, we didn't need that much data. The internal structure of our model matched the internal structure of the retina. And it was a digital twin of the retina. It could reproduce 2 decades worth of experiments done on the retina, right? So that's remarkable, but we still have a conceptual question. How does the retina work? What are its computational principles? We weren't happy to just say, look, there's all these weights in the neural network, that's all you need. Okay? So for example, what are some of the experiments that we could reproduce? It turns out that your retina contains what's called a world model. Right? World models are all the rage in artificial intelligence now. What are they? They're models of the world that predict what will happen in the future, potentially contingent on some actions that you've taken. How good's the translation? I can't tell. But all right, so the retina already has a world model. Like the AI people are working hard to build world models. They don't often realize that the retina already has one. So what do I mean by that? It can predict what's going to happen next in the world, and it sends violations of those predictions to the brain. So for example, in this setting, what you're looking at is you show full field flashes, like bright, dark, bright, dark. The entire visual field is going bright, dark at some periodicity, right? Of course, the retina, neurons in the retina will fire every time it changes from bright to dark or vice versa. But then you suddenly stop the flashes, okay? Then the retina will send a huge complaint to the brain as if it's saying, hey, a flash was supposed to come, it didn't. I better warn the brain. Okay, I'm anthropomorphizing the retina a little bit, but that's okay. We all have them. All right. So it can detect violations of periodicity over a range of frequencies. It doesn't just work at one frequency, it works at a range. So as if the retina can learn quickly that the world is periodic, and when it's not, it sends a complaint to the brain. Newton's first law of motion, right? This is the law that says that an object is in motion. Unless acted on by forces, it tends to remain in motion at the same velocity. Right? What if you have a bar that suddenly reverses direction? There are neurons in your retina that will send a huge complaint right when the bar reverses direction. Right? So it's as if the retina already knows about Newton's first law of motion, and when it's violated, it sends a complaint to the brain. It's saying, hey, this bar changed direction, something funny's going on there, let me alert the brain. Okay? Another one, right? Your eyes are darting about, about 2 or 3 times a second. Okay? So what does that mean? It means the light pattern in your retina is completely changing every second or so, right? Or every fraction of a second. But you're not experiencing that the world is moving around and you're getting dizzy and all that kind of stuff, right? You know that you're in place. The world is fixed. It's just your eyes that are moving, right? How does your brain sort that out, right? Because sometimes things do change in your retina and the world is moving, right? So how does the brain separate real motion out there in the world from induced changes of light patterns in your retina because your eyes moved, right? Remarkably, the retina already sorts that out. There are cells that separate global motion. So you can take, for example, a bunch of stripes and move them across a retina in a dish, right? And there will be cells that don't fire at all, right? But if you have local motion, where in a local region, the bar is moving left-right, but the global motion is out of phase, right? So that's this gray versus red. They're out of phase with respect to each other. Then the same cell will fire a lot. It's saying there's a local motion that cannot be predicted from the surrounding motion. Something's going on in the world. Let me send a warning to the brain. Okay, so these are three remarkably simple things, okay? Despite the fact that these types of images were not, or movies were not in our training data, we just trained the retina on natural movies, our model got every single one of these correct, okay? But now this begs a question, this begs a basic question. How did it get it correct, right? This is a qualitative question. You know, why did this violation occur? Why did this violation occur? What's the difference between this and this? A correct answer can't possibly lie in, well, these are the weights, right? Well, I mean, in some sense it is in the weights, but how is it in the weights? So we solved that problem for all of these classes of stimuli, and I won't go into the details, but what we did is we used explainable AI methods to look at this model for one of the stimuli, and we did each one separately. And we asked, say, for a particular stimulus, say the violation of Newton's first law stimulus, we looked at when the network computed the violation, the warning signal, and we backtracked and figured out which neurons in the previous layer were important for generating the violation, then which neurons in the previous layer were important for generating the violation, and we carved out of it a much smaller network that reproduced the phenomenon on that particular stimulus. And for different stimuli, it was different neurons that were carved out. Then we went back to the literature and we said, well, okay, the people who did this experiment 15 years ago, what did they think the model was in the literature? And every time we did this, the simple model that we got out matched what people thought was the correct model in the literature, right? But no one had ever put these different models together in one neural network that could mimic the response to natural movies. So in some sense, we were able to reproduce the 2 decades of science just in a few hours with our neural network, right? So in general, this provides a way to accelerating neuroscientific discovery through the confluence of neuroscience and AI. Okay, another type of explainability, now not in the brain, but in these diffusion models that generate all sorts of images. So we probably all played around with image generation. You get all these crazy images and they look quite creative, right? Where is this creativity coming from? Can we understand that? And so the birth of generative AI actually came from physics. So the first diffusion model was actually created in my lab by Joshua Soldikstein. And we were actually literally thinking about the second law of thermodynamics, which is that disorder grows with time, entropy grows with time. So any system left to its own devices, the entropy will increase over time. Order will go to disorder. Okay? We were thinking, how can we violate the second law of thermodynamics by changing the rules of the game? And so we realized that we can do that by changing the reverse process. So for example, okay, so what's the idea behind a diffusion model? You can take some data, in this case an image, and you can ask each pixel to do a random walk in intensity space, right? So each pixel changes randomly, and if you continue this so-called diffusion of pixels, clearly you'll add more and more noise until you'll be completely random, right? This is a classic example of an entropy generating process or a disorder generating process. Now, it doesn't matter how long you wait. If you allow these pixels to keep diffusing, you'll never see the reverse path. It's way too unlikely. Okay? But what if you change the reverse process to not be diffusion, but a neural network that's trained explicitly to go from noise and reverse the whole process? Then you can actually train it to go back, maybe not to the identical dog, but to a similar dog, right? So that's what we did. We trained a reverse process to go back, and Joshua got it to work remarkably. And it was pretty surprising to us. And then, of course, it got scaled up in industry, much bigger models, much bigger data sets, and you got all the amazing image generation that you see. Also algorithmic improvements and things like that. But this still begs the question, where is the creativity coming from? How did it generate sensible structure that's different from what's in the training set? Right? Well, we figured out a theory like 10 years later. Okay? We weren't actually thinking about it for 10 years. We procrastinated for 9 years, and then we started thinking about it. Because I realized that diffusion models started becoming important, so I thought maybe we should think about them. And then here's the basic idea. The neural networks that implement the reverse process, so they take as input an image and spit out how the image should change in the reverse process, these neural networks aren't infinitely expressive. They have this locality, which means that a certain pixel, when it's deciding how to flow in the reverse, how to flow in the reverse process, it only pays attention to some local neighborhood. So what that means is that each pixel will flow back in time, and its local neighborhood will look like some training set image patch from some training set image. But another location will flow back in time and start to look like some training set image patch from another training set image. And so what it does is it builds up a patch mosaic. It creates new images by picking one training set image and kind of putting it down here, another training set image patch and putting it down here, and putting up a bunch of patches. Just like we build Legos by mixing and matching Lego pieces in different configurations, this builds images by mixing and matching local image patches at different locations. That's it. We can turn this into an analytic differential equation that without any training generates images. Does it match what trained diffusion models do? And remarkably, it does. So what you're looking at here is now you're looking at pairs of images. The right-hand pair is an image spit out by a trained diffusion model, a neural network, a very complicated neural network that we don't understand how it works. The left-hand image takes the same noise that was input to the neural network, but it feeds it into our analytic ODE, which we completely understand. And you'll see that our analytic differential equation spits out essentially the same image as a trained neural network. In fact, the correlation coefficient between the theoretical image and its experimental version is around 0.9 in pixel space. So it's incredibly rare in machine learning to be able to predict on a case-by-case basis what an AI system will spit out at such a high level of correlation. So in this setting, it was actually quite simple. All right, again, going back to neuroscience. So what this is showing is that this digital twin approach can accelerate neuroscience discovery. But we don't need to be satisfied with just recording from the brain. We can now stimulate the brain due to incredible advances in neurotechnology. So this opens the door to doing the following. And this is a research program that I'm following right now. So we can record from the brain and build a digital twin. Then we might want to get the brain to behave in a certain way. So what we can do is we can apply control theory. Well, we can use explainable AI to understand the digital twin, and we can use control theory to try to control the digital twin by learning what stimulation patterns we need to put into the digital twin to get it to behave in a certain way. Then, once we've learned those stimulation patterns, we can transfer those stimulation patterns to the brain to try to get the brain to behave in the same way, right? So this is like learning to speak the language of the brain and then speaking modified versions of the language back to it to control the brain, okay? Okay, so what does that actually look like? So here's an example, by the way, of a so-called brain observatory that my colleague, very close collaborator of mine, Mark Schnitzer at Stanford, can build. he has this crazy microscope that scans 16 laser beams simultaneously. So you probably can't see it, but here's a mouse sitting here. Here's some objective lenses. And they're scanning these 16 laser beams into the mouse's brain. And each time you scan a laser beam onto a neuron, you record through fluorescence how much activity that neuron is firing, right? He can even do 4 different arms that record from 4 different brain regions at once. So you can start to look at the propagation of signals across the entire mouse brain while the mouse is behaving, right? So this is remarkable. We can get around 10,000 neurons, and there's a credible path to get to 1 million neurons at once, okay? So here's an example of that type of data, right? So what you're looking at is you're seeing individual neurons, and for example, that one is going bright, they're going bright and dark. Whenever it becomes bright, a neuron is firing, right? It's sending a message to its neighbors, okay? And you're only seeing a part of the recording. It's really incredible, right? You're literally looking into the mind of a mouse, more precisely the brain of a mouse. So what can we do with that? We can actually decode what the mouse is seeing. So for example, we can learn a decoder from neural activity to the actual thing the mouse was seeing. These are actual images that the mouse sees, and these are the decoded images. And the decoded images are lower resolution, but that's not necessarily because our decoder is bad. It's because mouse visual resolution is worse than our resolution, right? But you can now start to see that you can learn the mapping between visual inputs to neural activity and the inverse mapping for neural activity to visual inputs. So you can literally read the brain of a mouse, right? Okay. Now we can also stimulate. By understanding the mouse's visual code, we can design stimulation patterns, again, by shining lasers into the brain using the magic of something called optogenetics. We can shine light into the brain and make neurons fire, okay? This optogenetics was invented by another collaborator of mine, Carl Dijsselroth at Stanford. And so then we could literally write patterns into the brain to make the mouse hallucinate a percept that we wanted to hallucinate. And we got so good at it that we could stimulate just 20 neurons, and we could get a mouse to hallucinate, for example, a simple striped pattern. We trained it to discriminate striped patterns, and then we stimulated the brain, and it acted as if it saw a striped pattern when we didn't show it the striped pattern. We replaced the striped pattern in the visual input with direct stimulation of the brain, right? And we could do it with only 20 neurons, and we have a theory for why we can do that. I won't go into the details of that. Okay. Recently, we can also create a digital twin of the epileptic brain. So in epilepsy, different brain regions start to oscillate, and the amplitude grows over time. We fit a dynamical system to the electrical patterns of activity across many different parts of the brain, and we came up with a large dynamical system that mimicked the onset of the epileptic seizure, right? So this is an experimental seizure, this is our model seizure, and they look very similar. In fact, we got all the relative phases across all pairs of brain regions correct in our model. Okay, so that's the AI part of it. But what about the explainable AI? What is the conceptual mechanism for the onset of a seizure? Why is the model suddenly transitioning from a non-seizure state to a seizure state? Well, we examined the differential equations underlying the model, and we found a very simple principle. We looked at pairs of couplings between brain regions, and we saw that when certain pairs of brain regions start to oscillate at a certain phase lag, then the amplitude grows. But if they oscillate at a different phase lag, the amplitude doesn't grow. Very simple principle that we couldn't have guessed. We extracted it from the model by mathematical analysis. But now this suggests an experiment, right? We can now again use optogenetics, and we can stimulate that pair of brain regions at the preferred phase lag, and then we did see the seizure amplitude grew. Then we simulated at the opposite phase lag, and the seizure amplitude did not grow. So our conceptual framework was validated in new experiments. And in particular, it taught us what the phase lag is. So that's another example of explainable AI to extract conceptual insight from digital twins and design the next generation of experiments. Okay, I'll just 3 or 4 more minutes. So big question, how do you know where you are? Okay? It seems kind of obvious, right? But actually, I'm going to do an experiment on all of you, okay? I'd like you to close your eyes and point to the nearest door. Close your eyes first, then point to the nearest door. Okay, now keep pointing and then open your eyes. You all did really well, okay? Now, if you really think about it, this is remarkable. You probably, actually, if you don't like my lecture, you're probably thinking about where the nearest door is. But I'll be optimistic and think that maybe you weren't thinking about the nearest door for the last, 50 minutes, okay? Just realized I set myself up, so I'll take the setup myself. So you walked in, you weren't paying attention to the doors after you walked in. The only inputs that your brain got was the pitter-patter of photons in your eyes and the pitter-patter of muscle contractions in your legs and arms and so on. That's it. You have no other sensory inputs relevant to figuring out where the nearest door is. Yet, somehow the brain computed out of this pitter-patter of photons and muscles, it computed a 3D model of the room, your location in the room within that 3D model, and it can turn that 3D model into motor commands to activate all the muscles to have your arm point in the right direction. Incredible. How did it do that? And it did it all subconsciously. Okay? Well, it turns out over the years we've learned a lot about the navigational system. And this is like one of the remarkable things. It was a subject of a Nobel Prize-winning discovery by the Mosers and also O'Keefe. These are called grid cells. Okay? So what you're looking at in this figure is a mouse is moving around this square enclosure that's about 1 meter big. Okay? And each of these dots, they're recording from a single neuron in the mouse's brain in a particular area called the grid cell area. A single neuron in the mouse's brain. And the dot comes down whenever that neuron fires. Okay? So what you can see is that this neuron fires if and only if the mouse is at the vertices of a hexagonal grid. Okay? Now there's many more neurons that are also hexagonal grid cells, and they fire at different phases relative to each other, and they also have multiple ones at different scales. This is incredible, right? It turns out not only mice have them, you have them, okay, in your brain, in the same homologous brain area. So what this area does is it integrates information over time to construct this 3D map. We won't go into the details of how it does that. That's a big subject. But the thing to look up would be grid cells, if you wanted to learn more. Okay, so now the question that we asked is, we can navigate in a new environment for the first time, right? How do these grid cell representations start to arise in a new environment that you've never been in before? Okay? I mean, you've probably been in this room before, but I haven't, but I think I can navigate through it for some amount of time with my eyes closed, right? Not too long. But so we put, and this is in collaboration with Lisa Giacomo at Stanford, another close collaborator of mine. We put mice on a trackball in a virtual reality environment, okay? So let me play this again. Yeah, so here's the mouse. It's running on a trackball. The environment moves at a speed proportional to how fast the mouse is running. So it's literally a virtual reality environment. The reason we do this is because we have to record from the mouse's brain, so we have to keep the microscope close to the mouse's brain. So this is a very common paradigm in neuroscience now. And so we can control the environment, and we can take these towers and we can add them one by one, right? So to make a long story short, we actually figured out the algorithm that the mouse uses to incorporate new towers that it's never seen before into its grid cell code. And then we could predict what the grid cell code looks like in a new environment that the mouse has entered for the first time that we don't have recordings for yet, right? And it's a very simple algorithm. Like as you move, you have two sources of information as to how you move: your eyes and the integration of your velocity. So landmarks and velocity. And we showed how to fuse these two pieces of information together to both implement a navigation algorithm and explain mouse data, right? Okay. Now here's the cool thing. How many of you have taken ketamine? I don't expect you to answer. Right? I haven't, right? But what I've heard is that it's very famous and well known. In ketamine, you can have these out-of-body dissociative experiences. You feel apparently that you're not in your body, you feel like you're somewhere else. You have these dissociations where you feel like there's somebody else in your brain and they're talking to you, or there's all sorts of crazy stuff that happens. Okay? So we can ask a very simple question. This mouse's navigational area that has these grid cells, what happens to them if the mouse is under ketamine? So we give the mice ketamine, and we record from the mouse's brain. So let me tell you a little bit about the brain anatomy that leads to these grid cells. So you have your retina, okay? The retina goes to your visual cortex in the back of your brain. That goes to an area called the retrosplenial cortex, and that goes to another area called the entorhinal cortex. This entorhinal cortex has the grid cells, which are thought to contain your global estimate of where you are in an environment. Okay? So if everything's working correctly, as you move around, these grid cells will change their activity patterns and track where you are. Right now, what happens under ketamine? Something remarkable happens. You get these pathological oscillations that appear in the retrosplenial cortex and only in the retrosplenial cortex. And then you find that these grid cells kind of dissolve or start drifting, right? So what's happening is the block between your visual information about there's a block in the pathway from the visual information about where you are to the part of the brain that computes an internal estimate of where you are. So then it's sort of clear that you should have some kind of strange out-of-body experience, because the part of your brain which estimates where you are is now untethered from true information about the outside world. So it's a very simple kind of thing. So we're actually doing, with Carl, we're doing a research program where we're trying to understand all sorts of impaired states of consciousness under all sorts of drugs. Ketamine, psilocybin, LSD, everything. We're doing a lot of drugs on mice. By the way, we're also doing it on humans, actually. On human patients, there are protocols where you can give low levels of drugs to human patients and record from their human brains as well. So we're doing that at the Stanford hospital. Carl is leading that work. And we're going to be analyzing the human data as well. So I think this is a very interesting way to understand altered states of consciousness. Okay, the last thing I'll tell you is this is a cute result we call letting the neural code speak. So neurons deep in the visual cortex respond in images in a complicated way. Right? There's neurons early in your visual cortex that are very simple. They respond to stripes of a certain orientation. We can sort of understand how that works. But deeper in the brain, they respond to very, very complicated sets of images. We don't understand them. We don't know how to mathematically model the set of images that make a particular neuron deep in the monkey's visual brain fire. Right? But what if monkey neurons could just tell us in human language what they like to fire to? Wouldn't that be awesome? Right? Now, how the heck can we get monkey visual neurons to tell us in human language what images they like to fire to? That seems almost impossible. We figured out a way. And it's actually like, I was actually a skeptic of this project until I'll tell you when I stopped being a skeptic. So how do we do it? So we have the monkey brain. We show a ton of images to the monkey brain and record many, many neurons. Again, this is in collaboration with Andreas Toliasz at Stanford. And so then we build a digital twin of the monkey brain, a neural network that when given a stimulus, it creates neural activity patterns that are similar to what you'd see in the monkey's brain. Okay? Then, now that we have an in silico model, we can do many, many experiments that we can't do in the actual monkey because we can operate at the speed of computers, not at the speed of monkeys. So then we can show 1 million images to the digital twin and pick a neuron in the digital twin that's in one-to-one correspondence with a neuron in the monkey's brain. And over those 1 million images, we can say find the top 20 that make it fire. And they do actually make the digital, by design, they make the digital twin neurons fire a lot. Then we can go take those images and show them back to the monkey and verify that it does make the monkey neurons fire a lot. So we have a very good model of the monkey brain, right? If an image makes the digital twin fire a lot, it also makes the monkey neuron fire a lot. Okay, great. So now we collect those most exciting images. Here are some examples of the most exciting images for one neuron, another neuron, another neuron, another neuron. They seem to have some structure, but we don't know how to mathematically model it. So what do? Like what a lot of us are doing, we just feed it to an LLM. We feed it to a vision language model. And we asked the LLM to describe it using English. And we asked for a very rich description. So for example, here's a description. The neuron responds strongly to distinct, rounded, and convex objects characterized by blah, blah, blah. Okay. Very rich description. Okay. And the English description sort of corresponds to the images, right? Now, at this point, I was still a skeptic of this project, but the student was very excited about it. So we suggested, like, how do we verify this? We can try to invert the map from language to vision. We can take these language descriptions, then we can feed it into a vision language model. So sorry, that's this step. We take the most exciting images, feed it to a vision language model, and get a language description. But then we can feed that language description into a diffusion model that takes a language prompt and generates an image, right? And we can do that many, many times because it's stochastic. So we get many, many new images. And then we can feed it back to the digital twin and see if it makes a neuron fire a lot, and it does. So that's a verification, right? So now for the first time ever, we have an algorithmic way to sample from infinitely many images that would make a particular neuron deep in the monkey's brain work. And the irony is that that sampling process had to go through human language. It's very bizarre. We couldn't do it mathematically, right? But this is an example of melding brains and machines to understand brains, right? Okay. We're actually now, I'm kind of involved in a startup, Metamorphic, where we're actually trying to create the biggest data set out there by orders of magnitude about monkey visual intelligence and distill it into artificial vision networks. And there's an Enigma project at Stanford that's on the academic side of this thing. So if you're interested, look up Enigma and Metamorphic. Metamorphic is the company, Enigma is the academic side. And this is all in close collaboration with Andreas Toliash. Okay, so in essence, melding minds and machines has immense opportunities to understand, cure, and augment the brain and AI. Okay, so just to summarize, I think there's an incredible time to be studying the science of intelligence. There's been so much advances in neurotechnology, in AI, and really theory needs to rise to the challenge of trying to explain what the heck just happened in the last decade in AI. Like what happened to us, and how do we guide the further development to be useful for society? And if you're interested in kind of a written version, not quite of this talk, but I recently wrote an invited article for the American Academy of Sciences, their magazine called Daedalus. A bunch of AI people wrote articles here. It's a great collection of articles. This one is mine, Towards the Science of Intelligence, Unifying Physics, Neuroscience, and AI. And I'll stop here. Thanks.